Wikipedia, media, and academia
Yes.
are all related to the question of independent replication versus prestigious citation.
Sure. So the problem is authority and prestige as you see it from academia and the media and Wikipedia with the editors. We have to have a mechanism where sort of the data and the reproducibility is what dominates the discourse.
That's right. And so one way of thinking about this is, I've said this in I think I tweeted this or something, but Western civilization actually has a break classification emergency button. It's called decentralization, right? Martin Luther hit it when the Catholic Church was too ossified and centralized, decentralized with the Protestant Reformation. Okay, he said, at the time, people were able to pay for indulgences, like that is to say, they could sin. They could say, okay, I sinned 5 times yesterday. Here's, the equivalent of $50. Okay, I'm done with my sin. I can go and sin some more. Okay, they should really buy their way out of sin. Okay, now people debate as to how frequent those indulgences were, but these are one of the things he inveighed against in the 95 Theses. So decentralization, boom, break away from this ossified church, start something new, right? And in theory, the quote religious wars of the 1600s that ensued were about things like where the wafer was the body of Christ or what have you, but in part, they were also about power and whether the centralized entity would write all the rules or the decentralized one would. And so what happened was obviously Catholicism still exists, but Protestantism also exists. Okay. And similarly, here you've got this ossified central institution where, forget about, there's complicated studies, they're difficult to summarize, but when you have the science saying masks don't work and then they do, okay, which everybody saw. And this is not like, everybody knew that there was not like some massive study that came out that changed our perspective on mask wearing. It was something that was just insistently asserted as this is what the science says. And then without any acknowledgement, the science said something different, the next day, right? I remember because I was in the middle of this debate. And I think you could justify masks early in the pandemic as a useful precaution. And then later, post-vaccination, perhaps not necessary. I think that's like the rational way of thinking about it. But the point was that such levels of uncertainty were not acknowledged. Instead, people, were basically lying in the name of science, and public policy wasn't public health; it was political health. Okay, so something like that, you're just spending down all the credibility of an institution for basically nothing. Okay, and so in such a circumstance, what do? Break glass, decentralize. What does that look like? Okay, so let me describe what I call crypto science. By analogy to, crypto, just like there's fiat science, crypto science, right? Fiat economics. Okay. So, in any experiment, any paper, when it comes out, right, you can sort of divide it into the analog to digital and the purely digital. Okay. So the analog to digital is you're running some instruments, you're getting some data. Okay. And then once you've got the data, you're generating figures and tables and text and a PDF from that data, right? Leave aside the data collection step for now. I'll come back to that, right? Just the purely digital part. What does the ideal, quote, academic paper look like in 2022, 2023? First, there's this concept called reproducible research, okay? Reproducible research is the idea that the PDF should be regenerated from the data and code. Okay, so you should be able to hit enter and regenerate it. Mm-hmm. Why is this really important as a concept? John Clairbout and David Donahoe at Stanford 20 years ago pioneered this in stats because the text alone often doesn't describe every parameter that goes into a figure or something, right? You kind of sometimes just need to look at the code and then it's easy. And without that, it's hard, okay? So reproducible research means you regenerate the PDF from the code and the data. You hit enter, okay? Now, one issue is that many papers out there in science, nature, et cetera, are not reproducible research. Moreover, the data isn't even public. Moreover, sometimes the paper isn't even public. Mm-hmm. The open access movement has been fighting this for the last 20-something years. There's various levels of this, like green and gold, open access, okay? So the first step is the code, the data, and the PDF go on-chain. Step number one, mm-hmm. Okay? The second thing is once you've got, so you can, anybody who is, and that could be the Ethereum chain, it could be its own dedicated chain, whatever, okay? It could be something where there's just the URLs are on the Ethereum chain, it's stored on Filecoin, many different implementations, but let's call that on-chain broadly, okay? Not just online, on-chain. When it's on-chain, it's public and anybody can get it. So that's first. Second is once you've got something where you can regenerate the code or the PDF from the code and the data on chain. Guess what? You can have citations between two papers turn into import statements.
Yeah, that's funny.
That's cool, right?
Yeah,
So
cool.
now you're not just getting composable finance like DeFi, where you have like one interest rate calculator calling another. You have composable science. And now you can say this paper on this, especially in ML, right? You'll often cite a previous paper and its benchmark or its method, right? You're gonna want to scatter plot sometimes your paper, your algorithm versus theirs on the same data set. That is facilitated if their entire paper is reproducible research that is generated. You can just literally import that Python, and then you can generate your figure off of it, right? Moreover, think about how that aids reproducibility, because you don't have to reproduce in the literal sense every single snippet of code that they did. You can literally use their code, import it. Okay, people start compounding on each other. It's better science. Okay, now I talked about this, but actually, there's a few folks who have been actually building this. So there's usescholar.org, which actually has a demo of this, like just a V1 like kind of prototype where it shows two stats papers on chain. And one of them is citing the other with an import statement. There's also a thing called I think DeSci.com, which is trying to do this. All right, decentralized science. So this itself changes how we think about papers. And actually, by the way, the inspiration for PageRank was actually citations. It was like the impact factor out of academia. That's where Larry Page and Sergey Brin got the concept out of, right? Mm-hmm. So now you've got a web of citations that are import statements on chain. In theory, you could track back a paper all the way back to its antecedents. Okay, so if it's citing something, you can now look it up and look it up and look it up. And a surprising number of papers actually, their antecedents don't terminate, or the original source says something different, or it just kind of got garbled like a telephone game. And there's this famous thing on like the spinach. Does it actually have iron in it or something like that? I forget the details on this story, but it was something where you track back the citations and people are contradicting each other. Okay, but it's just something that just gets copy pasted, and it's a fact that's not actually a fact because it's not audited properly. This allows you to cheaply audit, in theory, all the way back to Maxwell or Newton or something like that. Yes. Okay. Now, what I'm describing is a big problem, but it's a finite problem. It's essentially taking all the important papers and putting them on chain. It's about the scale of, let's say, Wikipedia. Okay. So it's like, I don't know, a few 100,000, a few million papers. I don't know the exact number, but it'll be at that level. Okay. So now you've got, number one, these things that are on chain. Okay. Number two, you've turned citations into import statements. Number three, anybody can now, at a minimum, download that code. And while they may not have the instruments, and I'll come back to that point, while they may not have the instruments, they can do internal checks, the Benford's Law stuff we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. You can internally check the consistency of these tables and graphs, and often you'll find fraud or things that don't add up that way because all the code and the data is there, right? And now you've made it so that anybody in Brazil, in India, in Nigeria, they may not have an academic, library access and so on, but they can get into this. All right. Now, how do you fund all of this? Well, good thing is crypto actually allows tools for that as well. Andrew Huberman and others have started doing things like with NFTs to fund their lab. I can talk about the funding aspect. There's things like researchhub.com, which are trying to issue tokens for labs. But a lab isn't that expensive to fund. Maybe it's a few 100,000, a few million a year, depending on where you are. Crypto does generate money. And so you can probably imagine various tools, whether it's tokens or NFTs or something like that to fund. Finally, what this does is it is not QAnon, right? It is not saying don't trust anybody. Neither is it just trust the centralized academic establishment. Instead, it's saying trust because you can verify, because we can download things and run them. The crucial thing that I'm assuming here is the billions of supercomputers around the world that we have, all the MacBooks and iPhones that can crank through lots and lots of computation. So everything digital, we can verify it locally, okay? Now, there's one last step, which is I mentioned the instruments, right? Whether it's your sequencing machine or your accelerometer or something like that is generating the data that you are reporting in your paper when you put it on chain, okay? Basically, you think of that as the analog to digital interface. We can cryptofy that too. Why? For example, an Illumina sequencing machine has an experiment manifest. And when that's written to, there's a website called NCBI, National Center for Biotechnology Information. You can see the experiment metadata on various sequencing runs. It'll tell you what instrument and what time it was run and who ran it and so on and so forth. Okay. What that does is allows you to correct for things like batch effects. Sometimes you will sequence on this day and the next day, and maybe the humidity or something like that makes it look like there's a statistically significant difference between your two results, but it was just actually batch effects. Okay. Mm-hmm. What's my point? Point is, if you have a crypto instrument, you can have, various hashes and stuff of the data as a chain of custody for the data itself that are streamed and written on chain that the manufacturer can program into this. For anything that's really, and you might say, well, boy, that's overkill, right? I'm saying actually not. You know why? If you're doing a study whose results are going to be used to influence a policy that's going to control the lives of millions of people, every single step has to be totally audible. You need the glass box model. You need to be able to go back to the raw data. You need to be able to interrogate that. Mm-hmm. And again, this is, anybody who's a good scientist will embrace this. Right?
So first of all, that was a brilliant exposition of a future of science that I would love to see. The pushback I'll provide, which is not really a pushback, is like what you describe is so much better than what we currently have, that I think a lot of people would say any of the sub steps you suggest are already going to be a huge improvement. So even just sharing the code.
Yes.
Or sharing the data. You said I think it would surprise people how often
it's hard to get data.
It is like the actual data or specifics or a large number of the parameters. Not you'll share like one or two parameters that were involved with running the experiment. You won't mention the machines involved, except maybe at a high level, but the versions and so on, the dates when the experiments were run, You don't mention any of this kind of stuff.
Right.
So there's several ways to fix this. And one of them, I think, implied in what you're describing is a culture that says it's not okay.
Exactly.
So first of all, there should be, even if it's not perfectly on chain to where you can automatically import all the way to Newton, just even the act of sharing the code, sharing the data, maybe in a way that's not perfectly integrated into a larger structure, is already a very big positive step.
Yes.
Saying, like, if you don't do this, then this doesn't count. And because in general, I think my worry, as somebody who's a programmer, who's OCD, I love the picture you paint that you can just import everything and it all automatically checks everything. My problem is that makes incremental science easier and revolutionary science harder.
Oh, I actually very much disagree with that.
I would love to hear your argument. You guys, let me just kind of elaborate.
Sure.
Why sometimes you have to think in this gray area of fuzziness when you're thinking on totally novel ideas, and when you have to concretize in data. Like some of the greatest papers I've ever written don't have data. They're in the space of ideas almost. Like you're kind of sketching stuff and there could be errors, but like Einstein himself with the famous 5 papers, I mean they're really strong, but they're fuzzy. They're a little bit fuzzy. And so I think, even like the GAN paper, you're often thinking of like new data sets, new ideas. And I think maybe as a step after the paper is written, you could probably concretize it, integrate it into the rest of science.
Sure.
But, like you shouldn't feel that pressure, I guess, early on.
Well, I mean, there's different, each of the steps that I'm talking about, right? There's like the data being public and everything. Just having the paper being public, that's like V1, right? Then you have the thing being regenerated from code and data, like the PDF being regenerated from code and data. Then you have the citations as import statements. Then you have the full citation graph as an import statement. So you just follow it all the way back, right? And now you have, that gives you auditability. Then you have the off-chain, the analog digital crypto custody, right? Like where you're hashing things and streaming things. So you have the chain of custody. Each of those is kind of like a level up and adds to complexity. But it also adds to the auditability and the verifiability and the reproducibility. But, one thing I'd say I wanted to respond to that you said was that you think that this would be good for incremental but not innovative. I actually think it's quite the opposite. I think academia is institutional and it's not innovative. For example, NIH has this graph which is like, I think it's age of recipients of R01 grants. Okay.
Mhm.
And what it shows is basically it's like a hump that moves over time, roughly plus 1 year forward for the average age as the year moves on.
Mhm.
Okay. And I'll see if I can find the GIF. Why is this? Let me see if I can find it actually. Look at this movie just for a second. It's a ridiculously powerful movie and it's 30 seconds.
What's that?
I just sent it in WhatsApp.
The name of the video is Age Distribution of NIH Principal Investigators and Medical School Faculty. And it starts out on the x-axis is age with the distribution and percent of PIs. And from early 1980s, moving 1 year at a time. And the mean of the distribution is moving slowly, approximately, as Balaji has said, about 1 year
Per year.
per year.
Now, this is 10 years ago. But
1 year in age per year of time.
And notice how, first of all, the average age is moving way upward before you become an NIHPI. Second is, it's a cohort of guys, people, who are just awarding grants to each other.
Yeah.
That's clearly what's happening. That's the underlying dynamic. They're not awarding grants to folks who are much younger, okay, because those folks haven't proven themselves yet, right? Mm-hmm. So it is this is what happens when you get prestigious citation rather than independent replication. The age just keeps creeping up. And this was 10 years ago, and it's gotten even worse. It's become even more gerontocratic, even more hidebound, right? And so the thing is, the structures that Vannevar Bush and others set up, the entire post-war science establishment, one thing I'll often find is people will say, Balaji, the government hath granted us the internet and self-driving cars and space flight and so on. How can you possibly be against the U.S. government? Kneel and repent for its bounty, And really the reason they don't say it quite in that way, but that's really the underpinning kind of thing, because they've replaced GOD with GOV. They really think of the U.S. government as God. The conservative will think of the U.S. government as like the all-powerful military abroad, and the progressive will think of it as the benign, all-powerful, like nurturing parent at home. Okay, but in this context, they're like, how come you, as some tech bro, could possibly think you could ever do basic science without the funding of the U.S. government? Has it not developed all basic science, right? Mm-hmm. And the answer to this is actually to say, well, what if we go further back than 1950? Did science happen before 1950? Well, I think it did. Bernoulli and, Maxwell and Newton, were they funded by NSF? No, they weren't, right? Were aviation, railroads, automobiles, gigantic, industries that arose and that both were stimulated by and stimulated development of pure science? Were they funded by NSF? No, they were not, right? Therefore, NSF is not a necessary condition for the presence of science. Neither is even the United States. Obviously, a lot of these discoveries, Newton was before, I believe is before the American, let me find the exact, it's actually less old than people think. Okay, so Newton died 1727, right? So I knew that, it was like in the 1700s. So Newton was before the American Revolution, right? Obviously, that meant huge innovations could happen before the US government, before NIH, before NSF, right? Which means they are not a necessary condition, number one. That itself is crucial, because a lot of people say the government is necessary for basic science. It is not necessary for basic science. It is one possible catalyst. And I would argue that mid-century, it was okay, because mid-century was the time when the middle of the centralized century. 1933, 1945, 1969, you have Hoover Dam, you have the Manhattan Project, you have Apollo. That generation was acclimatized to a centralized U.S. government that could accomplish great things, partly because technology favored centralization going into 1950 and then started favoring decentralization going out of it. I've talked about this in the book. Sovereign Individual has talked about this, but very roughly, you go up into 1950 and you have mass media and mass production, and just centralization of all kinds, giant nation states slugging it out on the world stage. And you go out in 1950 and you get cable news and personal computers and the internet and mobile phones and cryptocurrency, and you have the decentralization. And so this entire centralized scientific establishment was set up at the peak of the centralized century, and it might have been the right thing to do at that time, but is now showing its age. And it's no longer actually geared up for what we have. Where are the huge innovations coming out of? Well, Satoshi Nakamoto was not, to our knowledge, a professor right? That's this revolutionary thing that came outside of it. Early in the pandemic, there was something called project-evidence.github.io, which accumulated all of the evidence for the coronavirus possibly having been a lab leak, when that was a very controversial thing to discuss, right? Alina Chan, to her credit, Matt Ridley and Alina Chan have written this book, on whether the coronavirus was a lab leak or not. I think it's plausible that it was. I can't say I'm 100% sure, but I think it is a hypothesis worthy of discussion. Okay. Though of course it's got political overtones. Point being that the pseudonymous online publication at project-evidence.github.io happened when it was taboo to do so. So we're back to the age of pseudonymous publication where only the arguments can be argued with. The person can't be attacked. Okay. This is actually something that used to happen in the past. Like, there's a famous story where Newton solved a problem. Someone said, I know the lion by his claw, or something like that, right? People used to do pseudonymous publication in the past so that they would be judged on part by their scientific ideas and not the person themselves, right? And so, I do disagree that this is the incremental stuff. This is actually the innovative stuff. The incremental stuff is going to be the institutional gerontocracy that's academia, where it's like, do you know who I am? I'm a Harvard professor.
Yeah,
Science.
I don't. I think I agree with everything you said, but I'm not going to get stuck on technicalities.
Sure.
Because I think I was referring to your vision of data sets and importing code.
Sure.
And so that forces, just knowing how code works, it forces a structure, and structure usually favors incremental progress. Like if you fork code, you're not going to, it decentivizes revolution. You want to go from scratch.
Okay, so I understand your point there. Yeah. Okay. And I also agree that some papers like Francis Crick on the claustrum or others are theoretical. They're more about like where to dig than the data itself and so on and so forth, right? So I agree with that. Still, I don't, the counter argument is rather than 1,000 people reading this paper to try to rebuild the whole thing and do it with errors, when they can just import, they can more easily build upon what others have done, right?
Oh, yeah. And so the paper should be forkable.
Well, yeah. So here's what, Python has this concept of batteries included for the standard library, right? Because it lets you just import, and just get to work, right? That means you can fly. Whereas if you couldn't do all those things and you had to rewrite string handling, you would only be able to do incremental things. Libraries actually allow for greater innovation. That's my counter.
I think you create, I think that paints a picture. I hope that's a picture that fits with science. It certainly does. It fits with code very well. I just wonder how much of science can be that, which is you import, how much of it is possible to do that. Certainly for the things I work on, you can, which is the machine learning world, all the computer science world. But whether you can do that for, all right, you can think biology. It seems to, yes, I think so. Chemistry, I think so. And then you start getting into weird stuff like psychology, which some people don't even think is a science. No, just love for my psychology friends. I think as you get farther and farther away from things that are like hard technical fields, it starts getting tougher and tougher and tougher to have like importable code.
Okay, so let me give the strong form version, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a guy who I think is a great machine learning guy, creator of actually Keras, who he disagrees with me on, Francois Schiller.
Yeah, he's been on this podcast twice. Yeah.
Okay, great. So he disagrees.
I disagree with him on a lot of stuff.
Yes, me too. I think we have mutual respect. Follow each other on Twitter, whatever.
I think he does respect and like you.
Here's something which I totally agree with him on, and he actually got like trolled or attacked for this, but I completely agree. Within 10, 20 years, nearly every branch of science will be, for all intents and purposes, a branch of computer science. Computational physics, computational chemistry, computational biology, computational medicine, even computational archaeology, realistic simulations, big data analysis, and ML everywhere. That to me is incredibly obvious. Why? First of all we're doing every day is PDFs and data analysis on a computer, right? And so every single one of those areas can be reduced to the analog to digital step, and then it's all digital. Then you're flying, you're in the cloud, right?
Did he put a date? Did he say how long? Or
10 to 20 years, he was thinking.
10 20 years.
I mean, I think arguably it's already there, right? And here's the thing. You were saying, well, you might drop off when you hit psychology or history. Actually, I think it's the softer sciences that are going to harden up. Why? One of the things I talk about a lot in the book is, for example, with history, the concept of crypto history makes history computable. One way of thinking about it is, remember my Britney Spears example, right? Where Queen Britney, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So at first, it's kind of a funny thing to say a computer scientist's term for history is the log files. Until we realized that, what would a future historian, how would they write about the history of the 2010s? Well, a huge part of that history occurred on the servers of Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah.
So now you go from like a log file, which is just the individual record of like one server's action, to a decade worth of data on literally billions of people. All of their online lives, like arguably, that's why I say that's like actually what the written history was of the 2010s, was this giant digital history. As you go to the 2020s and the 2030s, more of that is going to move from merely online to on-chain and then cryptographically verifiable. So that soft subject of history becomes something that you can calculate things like Google Trends and Ngrams and stuff like that.
Yes, beautifully put. Then I would venture to say that Donald Trump was erased from history when he was removed from Twitter and many social platforms, and all his tweets were gone.
I think it's someone who has an archive of it, but yeah, I understand your point.
Yeah. Well, as the flood of data about each individual increases, censorship, it becomes much more difficult to actually have an archive of stuff. But yes, for important people like a president of the United States, yes.